I would like to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the first ever BC webinar hosted by the Renegade Institute for Liberty. I'm your host, Dr. Matthew Garrett. I'm a professor of history at Bakersfield College and the faculty lead for the Renegade Institute. I'm excited to have the good fortune to have our guest with us here today. But before I introduce him, I'd like to make a small plug for our little organization. The Renegade Institute for Liberty is a coalition of Bakersfield College faculty who are committed to free speech and open inquiry that supports genuine diversity of thought with an overt endorsement of Western traditions like fact-based reasoning, republicanism, individualism, meritocracy. All of the hosts are open to the public and are made possible by the generosity of our speakers and the limited funding that we receive from charitable donations. If you enjoy our event tonight, I hope you will consider making a tax-deductible donation so that we can host similar events in the future. As you may have noticed in this format, our guest and I enjoy unique power of speaking, but all participants are welcome to share their questions and answers in the Q&A box. At the close of our guest's prepared remarks, he and I will go back and forth as I read some of those questions off and he answers and shares his thoughts. I expect the entire event to go about 1 hour, and I'd like to add that I am very much delighted that we can provide this opportunity for our students and our community here in Kern County. Our guest this evening is Dr. Wilfred Reilly. He is an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University and holds advanced degrees in law and political science, and is the author of several controversial books, including Hate Crime Hoax and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Both texts explore the gap between the popular narratives and reality. Dr. Reilly is particularly concerned with the ideological assumptions that lead us to faulty reasoning. He has explored imagined violence, disproportionate focus on non-representative samples. He has coined an acronym for a core concept that really undermines critical thinking. He says, CON, Continued Oppression Narrative. What sets Dr. Reilly apart from so many others commenting on social issues is that his work is deeply grounded in empirical research. That is, he uses hard data. In an era when theoretical models like critical race theory are used to cherry pick examples that reaffirm preconceived notions, Dr. Reilly is committed to honest academic inquiry built on multivariable analyses. That is, he looks at multiple factors, controls for each, and then figures out what's actually going on, while others blindly mix correlation and causation. Dr. Reilly works to separate out actual causes, and sometimes his results clash with popular conceptions. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wilfred Reilly.
Let me make sure my mic is on and all that. All right. Yeah, so very glad to be here. As a quote unquote edgy academic, I always feel tempted to open up every one of these speeches just by yelling, Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. But in terms of background, as the host noted, I'm Wilfred Reilly. I'm an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University, and I am the author of the books Hate Crime Hoax and Taboo, which I certainly encourage you to buy, being a capitalist. And I'm very glad to be here today. Thanks to you guys for inviting me. The topic of my speech today is pretty broad and is very related to the second book that I mentioned. The header, as I recall from the flyers I've gotten from your team, is Taboo, Race and Other Topics You Just Can't Talk About. And basically, Dr. Garrett and other faculty members affiliated with Bakersfield College and with Renegade Institute asked me to come in and talk about some of the things that I've been researching lately. And I'll preface the conversation itself by noting what it is that I do. So in addition to some very wonky stuff, specifically in the political science space, looking at the causes of war and terrorism, my big interest is looking very specifically at some of the influential claims made by the political right and left. An example of this would be white privilege, and seeing whether they have a measurable basis in fact. So, for example, I once had a regionally televised debate with one of the leading figures on the very far right, a guy named Jared Taylor, about his claim that racial diversity causes problems for societies. And my position, which I believe to be supported by fact, is that there certainly are some positives and some negatives of diversity, but that there's really no evidence that one race but tribally divided societies, which is most of the world, Bosnia, Somalia, are in fact more peaceful than racially diverse countries like the USA or Costa Rica or Brazil or Singapore or India. I don't think there's any evidence of that whatsoever, statistically, empirically. Flipping over to kind of the left side of the fence, for my graduate dissertation, I looked at a very famous claim by Andrew Hacker that under sort of Queen's University, left-leaning, very skilled social scientist, but that under sort of experimental conditions, white people would demand a very large amount of money. It was $50 million, as I recall, to change their race. And this shows sort of the value of white status in, our racist, sexist, etc., patriarchal society. And what I found is that under the same conditions that Dr. Hacker used in his experiment, Black and Asian Americans would demand more money. We demanded about 80 million to change our race over on the POC side of the fence. And members of these groups specifically would cite advantages of being minorities, like group pride, perceived skills like athleticism, the benefits of affirmative action, just as Caucasians cited the advantages that go along with being white. So the dissertation ended up becoming a book. And what I found is that there don't seem to be dramatic differences in racism, defined as Hacker did. We can debate whether that is racism at all, between whites and people of color in reality, when we look at the numbers, which is going to be kind of a recurring focus here. So my most recent book, Taboo, really extends this question of, is it true, to a lot of more serious modern issues. And I often find that very self-same lack of evidence, and that's the focus of my talk today. So the chapters of the book that have drawn notice, that a lot of people have responded to, really deal with the Black Lives Matter movement, interracial crime, systemic racism, the issues of the day. The claim, for example, that there's been a wave of Karen-style interracial crime against Black people, quote unquote, the claim of hidden systemic bias. Now, in the book, I also, I think, take down the extreme political right. I also look at immigration policy. But what I just said is really the core of the text of the book. And jumping right in, obviously, it's been nearly impossible to escape the Black Lives Matter argument during the past 4 to 5 years. And that argument is basically that a very large, very disproportionate number of Black people are killed by police on an annual basis. And this isn't my opinion. The activist Cherno Biko famously said on Fox News during prime time that an innocent Black man is murdered, his language, by police every day or so. Just searching for Black people disproportionately killed, that phrase in quotes, returns about 14 million articles. These almost all deal with the police, and they almost all make this one sentence point that a Black guy is 2 to 3 times as likely, proportionately, to be shot by police officers in the USA as a white guy. But what I find is that while we all oppose racism and brutality, this entire narrative collapses when we do any sort of modern empirical analysis. Linear regression, logistic regression, even skillful cross-tabulations, as they're called. First, out of 60 million total interactions in a typical year between police and civilians, the total number of people killed by the police is between 1,000 and 1,200. And of those, generally a bit under a quarter are identified as Black. So in 2015, which is the year that I look at in hate crime hoax, for example, 258 victims were Black. In 2019, which is the most recent year fully on record, we saw almost identical numbers. 249 police shooting victims, people shot by cops, were identified as Black. And among both Blacks and whites, the number of people who were shot who were unarmed innocents was tiny. It was infinitesimal. In 2015, there were 17 unarmed Black men that were shot by white cops, which is how I chose to look at the data that year. In 2019, there were 15 unarmed Black people shot by all cops. So if anything, you saw a slight decline. And I will note that Hispanic, Appalachian, Italian American, so on folks aren't getting brutalized either. The total number of unarmed people shot, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, was always under 100 every one of these years. So when you say this, the next argument tends to be, well, brothers is how it would normally be phrased in Kentucky. Black people are shot disproportionately, are abused disproportionately. But that doesn't really hold up either. You next have to adjust for crime rate, which almost exactly predicts how often members of a particular group are going to see the police. And unfortunately, the Black violent crime rate, the victim reported crime rate, is about 2.3 times the white rate. Now, as a Black man, I will note that whites dominate corporate crime, internet crime. I mean, there's an entire sector, the rave scene, the mass illegal parties in many cities. But cops, quite frankly, aren't often called to the block because someone's giving out hot stock tips. Just adjusting for the 230% difference in victim-reported crime, crimes the police are called to respond to, obviously closes the gap between African Americans making up 13% of the population and making up 20 to 30% of shooting victims. That's basically just straight, simple math. So once we do that one basic calculation, a lot of the BLM storyline is revealed to be, like many of the race conflict stories that we're going to go through, to be almost entirely a media creation. So in a typical year, 70% of police shootings are going to involve whites or Hispanics, I would say at least. But those cases will receive about 10% of national mass media coverage. You can test this yourself. Just go to Google or Bing and search well-known police shooting. The last time I did this, I used standard settings on Google. I deleted the cookies, and I got 2 Hispanic cases, 2 to 3 white cases, depending on how you count whites versus Caucasian Hispanics, and 36 Black cases among those articles that came up that were relevant. And as a result of this, as a result of who those in the press are choosing to cover, almost literally everyone in the world, or the developed world at least, knows who Michael Brown is. But no one has ever heard, for the most part, of Tony Timpa or Dylan Noble or Dylan Taylor. I encourage you to look all of these cases up, by the way. Nothing I'm saying here is at all exaggerated or even really debated. But we find the same pattern when a simpler way to put this actually would be setting aside the names that I've already provided. When I say that 70% of the people involved in violent altercations or fatal altercations with the police in a typical year are white or Caucasian, or white or Hispanic, a very easy challenge would be name 2 of them. When I've done this speaking to men's groups, to athletic teams, business roundtables, no one has ever been able to, and that illustrates perhaps the scope of one of the problems here. But we find this same pattern when it comes to racial conflict more broadly. One of the mass media stories during the past 2 to 3 years has been sort of the alleged plague of Karens, quote unquote, attacking Black people. I mean, Pool Patrol Paula, quote unquote, slugged a Black kid at a public pool. Barbecue Becky rudely challenged a Black family to move when she saw them grilling in a dog run section of a public park where fires are technically banned. And these kept coming. There was Central Park Dog Gate, quote unquote, where someone allegedly threatened to call police on a totally innocent Black guy after he had allegedly threatened her dog, sort of conflict in the public woods. There was Coupon Carl. All of these stories literally received front page treatment in papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the leaders of national journalism. And many of my preppy Black buddies, I will say, began to believe this kind of content. So between these narratives and the stories about police, Jacob Blake and Michael Brown and so on down the line, I've had many friends tell me they're scared to drive in public or to go to the mall. This was true pre-pandemic. For several weeks last summer, summer 2020, a popular trending hashtag on Twitter and Instagram was simply living while Black, hashtag living while Black, which was often described as almost impossible. And again, the reality turns out to be very, very different from the media mirage. First of all, let me note to the consumers of both left and right-wing media out there in the audience that interracial crime, the sort of violence and verbal abuse, beatings, what we see in the press, is a tiny percentage of crime. The person actually most likely to hurt or kill you is your ex-wife or your current husband for the ladies. It varies a little bit there. But if we get a little more technical and go beyond that sort of single anecdote and look at what's called the BJS report, the Bureau of Justice Statistics annual report for the recent year of 2018, 2019, the total number of violent crimes involving either a white perp and a black victim or a black perp and a white victim was about 600,000. And in contrast, there were 20 million crimes. There were 20 million what are called index crimes, which are violent crimes and property crimes serious enough for the feds to keep a record of. So all interracial conflict, at least between those two groups combined, was about 3% of serious crime. If I recall correctly, it was well under 10% just of violent crime in those specific categories. So far, that's surprising given the amount of panic that we see, that we have fed to us, but it's not really politically incorrect. But there's more to the data. Within that small set of barely over 600,000 interracial crimes, which would, again, include all of the aggravated assaults and most of the shoves and verbal assaults that we've been told about in the Times and the Post, within that set of criminals, I suppose, 548,000 perps were black and under 70,000 were white. So at least in 2018, 2019, far from there being an epidemic of white people unprovokedly attacking and hurting and killing black people, interracial crime was actually 90% black guys on white people. That was admittedly an unusual year. That is not normally the case. But interracial crime has been more than 75% black on white literally every year going back decades, going back probably to the 1960s. And to some extent, this is not even particularly surprising. There are 5 times as many white people in the United States as there are black people, although that does not totally explain the gap in attacks. And they also have more money if you're looking for motivations for crimes such as robbery, for example. But again, we have to realize that reality here is literally 180 degrees away from what we see every day on TV. Just to repeat that sort of fascinating data, serious interracial crime is 3% of crime and it's 80+% black on white. And this same feeling of almost revelation keeps arising when you dig deeper into this stuff, into these claims. So again, kind of sticking with this format of going on through Taboo, through the argument, the next chapter of the book digs into quote unquote systemic racism. The idea that even though segregation was abolished in 1954 legally, even though racism has been frankly illegal in the USA since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, at least if we're talking about discrimination, we can tell that mass prejudice still exists and has sort of gone underground from the simple fact that different groups perform differently. An example of this might be that black SAT scores are on average lower than white ones. And Hispanic scores on the college boards on the SAT are sometimes below those for blacks. Both of those groups on average also make less money than whites, and so on down the line. Social scientists like Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo have very openly argued that unless we want to accept, I suppose, that some groups are simply inferior to one another, gaps like this basically have to prove that we live in a very bigoted society. So the argument is that the only 2 possible explanations for these gaps are genetic inferiority, 1, and racism, 2. And the solutions that these scholars, these authors propose are pretty dramatic. Dr. Kendi, for example, wants, and I genuinely don't think he's kidding, we've bantered on Twitter a few times, a government department of anti-racism, which would work on making sure that basically the exact population percentage of every racial group works in every job field. Make the NBA and the NHL interesting to watch, if nothing else. But again, when I look at the hard data, I find that the underlying argument here is almost nonsensical. So there's a third explanation for why different groups of people could be performing differently. Groups that differ in terms of traits as important as race and sex often also differ in terms of almost everything else. And adjusting for those, what you could call cultural or situational variables, often totally explains the gaps that are glibly attributed to racism or to genes on the far right side of the fence. So when we look at income by group, for example, as I do in Taboo, and as people like Thomas Sowell and June O'Neill have done in the past, we find that there are a bunch of really obvious things that help us explain where people end up in life. One of them, starting with something totally non-controversial, is simply age. So the most common age for a Black man in the USA, it'd be completely fair to call this the modal average, is 27. The most common age for a white guy in the USA is 58. So that's not the mean, quote unquote, but it's not all that far from it. And you're obviously going to accumulate a fair amount of money and wealth during that extra 31 years of life. It's worth noting, by the way, the most common age, not the average, but the most common age for a Hispanic American is 11. So that's a very young, growing, rising Latino population. But in the meantime, at the moment, it wouldn't be surprising to see Latinos earn less money than Blacks or whites or Asians. You can't get a job when you're 10. So, I mean, another causal variable, independent variable, factor variable, explaining some of these things is region. So Black people are far more likely to live in the South. So are Mexican Americans, by the way, if you count the Southwest, where wages are often very similar for us and the white community, but are lower for everyone. So again, it doesn't make much sense to attribute the fact that people make less money in Mississippi than in Manhattan to racism or sexism or something like this. The cost of living is a fourth as high as well. A third variable that Sowell and the other genuine experts here look at is performance, qualifications, although it's become a bit awkward to say that these days. Any IQ test or standardized test score. So there may be some element of social class to that, but again, this doesn't have much to directly do with race. And it again simply doesn't make sense to assume that someone with a 1400 SAT who goes to Yale will wind up with the same income as someone with that solid 1010 who goes to Foothills Community College. So adjusting for just those three things and one other variable, if I recall O'Neill correctly, closes the gap in income earnings in life from about 18%, or in any particular year, more specifically, from about 18% to around 1%. So again, no one denies the existence of prejudice. No one argues that the world is perfect. But it's also the case that very few people would deny that affirmative action exists on the other side of the fence, or somehow fail to notice that the USA today is 39% individuals of color and probably 90% non-racist. So very often in this complex, real, modern world, when we dig beyond these sort of media scare narratives, these things we're supposed to be afraid of, 5 warriors from the other side killing us, what we find is surprisingly positive news. We find that that's 3% of the actual risk that crime poses to you. And for a hokey but realistic closing line, it shouldn't be taboo to say that. That speech finished up a little more quickly than I thought, so I'm more than willing to take questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much. We do have some questions that are already starting to pop up.
Yeah, Q&A.
And so I'll give them to you. It looks to me like maybe the most complicated one we'll start with, because that might take you a little time to disentangle. It's from one of our philosophy instructors. He says, Professor Reilly, I love a study with counterintuitive results as much as anyone, but when I find a study with counterintuitive results, I look for concerns with methodology. So in that spirit, what do you make of the Knox-Lowe-Mumolo 2019 paper? Hopefully you're familiar with that, which concluded that administrative records mask racially biased policing. It seems that the damning of the Fryer, it seems to be a damning of the Fryer 2016 paper, which looked for bias in police shootings when you control for encounter types. While I have your ear, what do you make of the Ross 2018 paper that presented models which would explain how racial bias in policing can be consistent with Fryer's results? If you have any thoughts on any of those papers, I'm not familiar with them, but I imagine you probably are.
So first, thank you, your colleague, for an extremely well-phrased, on-point methodological question. I've only read one of the papers myself, but I will say, so I could just be babbling nonsense, But more realistically, I will say I've followed this debate pretty closely. And I think what we're talking about here is sort of the definition set for methodological parameters almost. So what Fryer finds is that a very simple, crude way to phrase Fryer's findings would be that if you adjust for a couple of things, most notably police encounter rates, there's no racial bias in who gets shot by police. So Roland Fryer puts out, I think, some of the more complex, better done regression models I've seen in this field. And he looks at whether, with everything held constant, so for example, characteristics of the accused perpetrator, I suppose, the individual stopped, race held constant, rate of police presence in the neighborhood held constant, so on, there is a greater chance of being shot if you are African American. And what he finds is that, being blunt, there's a greater chance of being shot if you're white. So as I recall, with everything held constant, you were 27.4% more likely to be shot as a Caucasian individual. I'd have to recheck whether Hispanics were included in the Caucasian category there, but you were less likely to be shot if you were a Black person. And critics of this paper, my understanding of the criticism is that what they are saying is that the reason police stop and engage with African Americans more is probably racism, or is at very least tainted by perceptions of racism. I'm on the other side of that debate, which holds that there's a check you can put on that, which is crime rate. So if you're looking at a logic model, basically what I would expect to see, some of the jargon aside, is that cops are in neighborhoods proportionately relative to the rate of crime in those neighborhoods, and then stop people in those neighborhoods proportionately to the rate of officers that are there. And that actually is pretty much what you find. So the Black violent crime rate, as per the BJS 2019, is 2.4 times the white violent crime rate. The Black police encounter rate, you or your colleague might correct me on this, but is 2.5 or 2.6 times the white police encounter rate, with any racism probably in that marginal 0.4 versus 0.5 there. And the rate of police shootings involving Black people is about 2.1 or 2.2 times what you would expect. So theoretically, you could say, yeah, Black people are shot less than you would expect from the rate at which they encounter the police, but why isn't the rate at which they encounter the police racist? To which I would respond, well, because it almost exactly matches the crime rate, you're going to have police where there's more crime. I'd actually be interested in seeing people look at some of these high crime white areas in Appalachia, anywhere from Appalachia to South Boston. I live in Appalachian, Kentucky myself, or 30 minutes from it, and see if there's a similar density of officers there. But I do think that's the answer, that it's hard to say that there is biased policing when the rate of crime matches the rate of police encounter, and that matches the rate of police shooting. We can certainly look for bias in the margins, and when we find individual troubled departments, we need to fix that immediately. But I don't think you can just look at that and say, oh, well, let's move a step back and find racism. Very often, racism is a 5% or 4% addition to something that's pretty predictable. You get more officers where you have more crime.
You're talking a lot about police violence here. And one of the other questions that's come up is, what about education success is another important discussion topic. Have you looked much at rates of success in different communities and what might be causing that? One of our questions coming in is what role does the internet play? The access to computers, parental support, what other factors might be conflated with racism?
Well, I think so. Obviously, in case anyone hasn't figured this out yet, I'm kind of center right politically. I often describe myself as a businessman with a gun in terms of background where I'm coming from. I came from that sort of no nonsense sales and trading floor world in Chicago. I grew up in the hood before that. I'm a pistol instructor for the NRA. So I tend to, while absolutely opposing things like racism and police brutality, gravitate towards sort of almost simple practical solutions to things. So obviously, I mean, for example, I'm a Fordham and Agbu guy when it comes to this. There are two input variables. One is obviously everything else being equal, it would be wonderful to go to school in heaven. I mean, there are school districts like Kansas City that have, in response to court orders, utterly rebuilt the district. They've built things like planetariums and fencing arenas and so on down the line. And although initially this didn't seem to improve test scores much, if at all, there has down the road been an overall positive effect. So yes, if you threw a massive amount of money at every school, I do think that would have some positive effects. It's hard to deny that. But it's also very clearly the case that caring, involved parents are probably the key variable here. Again, I teach at a historically Black college in Appalachia, and you see a dramatic difference between those kids freshman year whose parents and specifically dads are involved and those whose are not, unfortunately. And I know my secondary and primary level educators see that much more so. So if you actually look at the groups that are the most successful in the USA on standardized tests and later in terms of income, there are almost no Anglo-white groups among them. If you look at the SAT scores, and then if you look at, you can find both of these, search group income by ethnic group, household income by ethnic group. You'll find the Wikipedia and Britannica pages for that. And the test scores by ethnic group are a link at the bottom of at least one of those two. I mean, number one, I believe, is Indian Americans, Taiwanese Americans, Filipino Americans. The highest performing white groups were Jews and Lebanese people. So clearly there's something to be said for focusing a lot on academic training for your kids. And clearly that produces positive outcomes. I believe a last sentence here, but it was the OG Thomas Sowell, I think, who years ago looked at Black versus white incomes, and he found, or IQ scores, sorry. And he found that adjusting for just 4 variables, if I have this correct, totally closed the gap, which is no longer that big to begin with. But one was a father in the home. One was the number of books in the home. One was the grades that your mom demanded. And coming from a fairly academic household myself, I can see that and why that would be that specific parent. There's actually a book about this called Tiger Moms by Amy Chua. And the final one was the number of hours of study versus TV watching. It was kind of a ratio. So if you want to look at all 5 things, yes, all things considered, it's better to be rich. That's like the old boxing slogan, a good big man will always beat a good little man. But if you find yourself in the little man or woman position, you're going to a typical urban school, or more likely for your students, you're teaching in one in a couple of years, bear in mind that those things, exposure to reading early on, the 10,000 words, an involved mom, that stuff is most of what matters. We see this all the time. I mean, West Indian, Russian, Jewish, Asian immigrants to the USA beat both Blacks and whites quite easily.
Great. You actually answered several of the other questions that were waiting for you, so we appreciate that. Another question that I'm seeing from several people, so I'll sort of gloss it together, but they're asking, with the media constantly sort of focusing on anecdotal stories to tell particular narratives, how do we as a community fix that problem? How do we get past those anecdotal stories and really understand what's going on and work at fixing whatever problems are really there?
So the question is, when you see Fox on the right or MSNBC on the left, and you see this terrible story, let's actually swing to the right and say, illegal immigrant kills beautiful blonde lady. How do you distinguish between that and patterns that actually exist in society? For junior scholars at a top regional college, I would say put some work in, read the newspaper. I mean, this really is something. My college, Southern Illinois University, actually got the New York Times for free, because we were a minority serving institution in the South or some such. But I mean, every day I'd go to the Student Center and I'd pick up the New York Times like I was a businessman back home in Chicago, and I'd read it. It was extremely useful, obviously to the left, but solid 3-page articles as opposed to that, that one sentence screaming on TV. Watch long form interviews. I mean, I've done a bunch to blatantly plug, but I mean, so has Dr. Soul, so have equivalents on the left like Alice Goffman. I mean, watching the Joe Rogan show is an underrated vehicle to actually looking. I mean, I think he's had half of the top 20 current best-selling authors in the country on there, like Abigail Shrier. So read the newspaper, go through JSTOR, check out actual scholastic articles, watch long form interviews. But I mean, the corollary to this is, when you see someone say something absurdly simplistic, don't assume it's true. This is true on right and left, by the way. Again, this is in sort of teacher mode here. I mean, earlier today, I was arguing with a feminist ex-girlfriend, and she mentioned in passing that women make 57 cents to each dollar men make. And your response to things like that should be, that clearly can't be true. I'm sure there's some sexism, but if that were true, why would any business owner ever hire men? And the next question that comes after that should be, what effect does basic adjustment of the kind we're doing as junior social scientists have on this data? I mean, so for example, when I was discussing incomes, if you adjust for age, that removes a fair chunk of the black-white gap. What would do the same for men and women? I mean, are the women in question working? Are they and the men in the same fields? You probably will encounter some sexism along the road here. How do we get more female surgeons? But what you'll probably find, what I actually found when I dug into this, is that the gap between male and female trial lawyers, for example, is about 1%. So you can start with the simplistic allegory you see on Fox or MSNBC, but work from there back to the truth. Don't ever assume that's true. There's an epidemic of black cops shooting white kids or some random ridiculous thing.
Great. So you've talked about a few different causes that we might look at other than racism, for poor performance in education or police encounters or whatnot. And several people here have been asking, I can see in the chat the question, about if you've gone back another step to see, well, what causes those things? What causes a low rate of black fathers in the home, or education, or economic problems? Could there be that racism or systemic racism is there just one level further back, or no, there's other causes for those that are not racism?
I'm glad your students thought of that almost immediately. I mean, that is the next point when you're arguing with an intelligent leftist on this, like, well, no, that's racism. And to me, there's almost a religious devotion to this idea that somewhere under this, there has to be kind of the old wars, the fact that we all fought one another and black people and natives were abused in addition to that. Sometimes that's true. Very often it's not. So when you look at some of these variables, I mean, so for example, I say that looking at age, region, and test scores, the fourth variable is years of work experience, by the way, which correlates very directly with age. That's why I didn't list it. That closes almost all of the black-white income gap. Okay. The next question that someone would almost always pose, because it's obviously very difficult to attribute age to racism, is, well, test scores, aren't those a result of racism? What we find actually is, no, not really. One thing a lot of people don't know is that something like 82% of black people are not poor. The average black income in the USA, after 60 years of the Civil Rights Act and affirmative action, is around 85% the average white income before you adjust for age and region. So simply saying, well, the black kids are struggling in Southern schools with no books and so on has not been true for a while. When Fordham and Agbu looked at this, and it's well worth reading these papers, Shaker Heights, 1989, 2003, they found a couple things. They did find some teacher bias, but one of the most notable things they found is that some groups of students, including both black kids and white athletes, studied about half as much as other groups of students. So I would say that one of the primary predictors, as by the way, a black athletic male, one of the primary predictors of test performance, and again, Asians and Nigerians do better than anyone else in the country, is the amount of time that you focus on the test. I think that's pretty undisputed after Agbu 2003. Now, what you could say about that, I guess, is, well, was the amount of time you spend on the test determined by racism? I think at some point, racism has to mean something. The idea that there's a slightly more athletically focused culture because we were more likely to live in the South, and that itself is partly due to, a lost race war 150 years ago, I don't think that's a very useful definition of racism. I think that racism is bias based on race. So I don't find these systemic explanations to have all that much power. The way I would phrase the valid content in them is, yes, it's absolutely true that black people and other groups, quote unquote Chicanos in Texas, Appalachian, quote unquote hillbilly whites, so they dislike the term, Native Americans, probably number one. It's absolutely true that there are groups that are more likely to be poor because of past conflict and oppression. I don't notice that these groups are treated dramatically differently from other poor people today. So if you took the groups I just mentioned and you put them in a lineup with, say, South Boston Irishmen or certainly Puerto Rican Americans or something like that, I don't think the second group would demonstrate higher levels of performance on the SAT or lower levels of police abuse. So I think that past abuse has led to poverty in certain regions, which has the negative corollaries that poverty always does. But I don't think that that's dramatically different from poverty for anyone else. So to a certain extent, I mean, there does have to be a point where excuse making stops. if you are a black guy or a white guy from Appalachia and you're currently living in a middle class home, my suggestion for how to improve that SAT score would be study more. Final point here. A lot of these problems also don't date to slavery or even to the oppression of Appalachian Caucasians, something like that. A lot of them date to the social revolution in the 1960s. I mean, like one of the students brought up fatherlessness. I mean, the rate of fatherlessness, of quote unquote illegitimacy in the black community was 10% in 1938. That's a famous article from the center-right black economist Walter Williams. Whites were doing even better, 6% as I recall. Now, if you look at the illegitimacy rate in white communities today, that's close to 40% with Caucasian Hispanics thrown in. For black people, we're at around 70%. So you can maybe argue that the difference between half and 70% is due to racism. I would probably dispute that, but you could argue that. But the growth, many hundreds of percent from 10% to 70% within 50 years, I mean, that's due to other factors. So I think instead of looking for this kind of one religious explanation in everything, what we should do is identify what the real problems are today. I mean, in the community I live in, working class, some white, some blacks, Kentucky, I mean, those would probably be crime, opiates, suicide, I mean, how to treat returning veterans, all that stuff. And there might be some small components of racial prejudice to that, some large components of class, but the problem itself could be solved. And I think that would benefit everyone suffering from the problem.
You know, you've referred to Thomas Sowell a few times, and in your last remarks there, you were talking about poverty and other issues going back only maybe from the Great Society or something. But I remember he wrote an article, he wrote an essay, Black Rednecks, where Thomas Sowell tries to trace it back to the early colonial period and says, look, that there were some particular behaviors from I think the Scotch Irish that were not particularly successful behaviors that were then adopted. And so he kind of takes this longer stretch of possible causes, but it's similarly saying it's not necessarily race, but there's some cultural issues that have been adopted here and there. There's a few questions that have been popping up from people. One, interesting enough, it's from an anonymous attendee, and I think that's a little bit telling about the question. But several of these folks have asked about what do they do as faculty members who maybe they obviously don't want racism, don't believe in racism, would like racism to stop, but are not fully on board with all of the social justice workshops and trainings that campuses are adopting, and are afraid to speak out because if they speak out, then someone will assume that they must be a racist and they might even lose their job. So several folks have asked, what's the best strategy for faculty and students and anyone who's concerned about that possible repercussion, but wants to wants to be true to themselves, and how do you deal with this problem?
I don't want to sound like a cynic here, but my advice as someone who is a very successful junior exec and investor and recently got tenure would be go and chuckle to yourself. I mean, I absolutely would not recommend that junior faculty members skip all these trainings and say, that's all bullshit in any kind of public forum. That's not probably the best way to get past that first marker where you can then talk a little more openly. So I think there are a couple things during the training itself, that's generally going to be run by someone very dedicated from an outside firm and so on. I mean, answer the questions, don't embarrass yourself. I personally, I'm not a big fan of kneeling and this sort of thing. But I mean, afterward, I think it's perfectly valid to discuss with your boss or with your colleagues what you thought of that, how productive that was. Faculty have often been successful at some institutions in derailing this kind of thing before it happens. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this, because I'm a pretty empirical guy. I mean, as I said, I lean right. But my first question about this was, does it work? And I actually, about a year back, read the literature on IBT, implicit bias testing, and most other CRTB, critical race theory based trainings. I wanted to see if they work. It could be that most white people have one or two remaining residual prejudices, and this training knocked those out and they improved the workplace environment. That's exactly the opposite of what happens, actually. If you just Google IBT doesn't work, you'll find these incredible meta-analyses. I mean, the major business press journals, Business Insider, IBI Times, have in fact taken notice of them, pulled them out of just the academic world. Implicit bias test results seem to have nothing to do with how racist you are in a practical fashion. My guess would be from the pistol instructor sideline, actually, they probably vary heavily with how quickly you react. So if you very quickly label the people in the negative column, either blacks or whites, as bad or whatever it is, I mean, you might be labeling yourself a racist as well. That's just a guess. I haven't surveyed enough instruments to say that. But I mean, there seems to be no correlation between your bias score and how well you treat other people at all. In fact, it seems likely that if you recognized you were a mild bigot, for example, I've talked to teammates and former trading floor guys who are mildly sexist, and they're very gentlemanly because they recognize this. So you would have to prove that someone who's a little bit racist is actually going to act on that without knowing anything about it over and over, without ever being called out in California by a black or Hispanic buddy. And that's a pretty strong working assumption. So there's no evidence that stuff works. I would point that out if it was strongly suggested. I would go to the training, wouldn't say anything to embarrass myself, critique afterward. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, there's a lot of nonsense people ask you to do at work. And I basically put that up there with like COVID-19 pattern recognition and so on. Again, the more you can avoid it, the better, to be sure. That's pretty much it.
You know, you've talked a lot about different studies and how to analyze data. And we have a question from one of our students who says, you know, he's looking at history and political science, and he wants to know about some of these skills that you're using. In my class that he's taking, we focus a lot on these particular learning and critical thinking skills. So he's asked, what skills do you use and how can we develop those skills, or what's the best way to learn these data analysis tools that you're using?
Well, I think that there are quite a few. So it depends what you mean. I mean, so obviously, one of the skills that I use as a researcher is deep diving into data. When I start a book, I print probably 500 articles. I think will be on point from scientific journals and elite popular press journals. I read them. There's no substitute for doing the work. In terms of what I do when I produce something like a conference paper, I'm a quant researcher. And in all honesty, I think I'm a solid B+ to A- methodologist, but I think a lot of what makes me stand out is that I'm a good writer and I talk about things that are quote unquote taboo. But the things that I do would generally be linear, logistic, or time series regression. So looking at the effect of one independent variable on a dependent variable with others held constant using various techniques to, weight that data and so on. What I would recommend in terms of learning those skills is, keep taking the methods classes that, from what I've heard, are available and good at your institution. As you move forward, if you go to grad school or go beyond the 4-year, go 2-year to 4-year to 6-year degree, as people say, I would keep those skills boned up. I will confess to a bit of quantitative prejudice. Very often I will see someone on kind of that center right say something, Fryer, for example, that's backed up by these 10 regression models involving 10,000 people and then 200 interviews. And I'll see their opponent saying something like, well, as a woman of color, I know my truth. And it's not necessarily that their truth is invalid, but I think that's one data point as versus the 10,000. It's worth noting you don't need to be a math geek to do this, by the way. I mean, a lot of this like cross tabulations of large in data. I mean, if you, for example, I recently, and this is still that like try it out in class level. I mean, we haven't gone through the full IRB process and so on, but I recently looked at one of the commonly used scales for privilege and had some people take it. And I mean, the data accumulation there at the most basic level would just be seeing what the averages are for white people, black people, so on. I'm going well beyond that. I'm putting it in the regression model and I'm, breaking it down in different ways. But I would start by reading a lot about your topic. Then I would go out and get a bunch of data, and then I would use the most advanced techniques possible to look at it.
Okay.
And never say your truth. That's just your opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got a few other questions. One that stands out to me is that you clearly are not a fan of Black Lives Matter. And some of the narrative that's being spun, but you also recognize there probably are some issues out there. So what amount of racism, should be tolerable? Shouldn't we say any amount is wrong? And the amount that is there, what strategy should we be using to combat that?
Well, I think that's a good question. So I don't think, first of all, I mean, it depends what you mean by racism. I mean, if someone walks by me and thinks, my ancestors once fought his, that guy's too dark skinned or too light skinned, I don't really care about that. I mean, the reality is that the groups that make up Americans, if you look at the four largest, I mean, Englishmen, people of Irish descent, Black Americans, people who are at least part native. Now, Asians are probably making a move. Hispanic Americans are moving into that category. But those people have all killed each other for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I mean, of course, there's anger that people may feel about things that happened ancestrally. Most people have a slight, and I think this is natural preference for their own group. If you ask people on quote unquote feeling thermometers, a Black man will generally rate Black men 6 points higher than white women or something like that. So some of this stuff, the internal tiny preference for your family group, I don't really view as all that problematic. Racism viewed as discrimination, I don't really think we should tolerate any of it, but the good news there is it's already against the law. So, I mean, perfection is hard to achieve. Utopia literally means no place. So when people say we need to eradicate racism, that's somewhat meaningless. We've passed a law against discrimination, and we've passed a secondary law, the National Set of Affirmative Action Policies that began with the Philadelphia Plan, that's designed to give minorities an advantage that compensates for the level of racism in society. And I would say it's now gone a little past that if you're looking at college and business, because there's substantially less racism than there was in 1967 today. But absent that, I mean, aside from that, can you get rid of all of the racism we have prohibited? I don't think so. My honest answer to the question is when we look at something like the actual wage gap between men and women moving to sexism, and we find that that's 1 to 2% when you adjust for whether or not women are working, or men are, I suppose, whether they're working in the same field, whether they're working the same number of hours. I think that sort of margin of error, 3 or 4%, is not extraordinarily frightening to me, because that is the margin of error in any study you're doing. So I don't think you can get to perfection. I don't think you're ever going to find an NBA that is exactly 8% Asian, 61% Caucasian, by the way, 49 to 51% female. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we should keep things within that margin of error, and we should keep racism illegal, and that's about all you can do.
So then when we have programs at BC and other university colleges that are focused on racial equity, one of the faculties asked, are these programs effective? Are they just going overboard then? Do we risk inflaming and making the situation worse? Are these effective programs that we should pursue?
I'm not a big fan of equity at all. So it's important that people outside the elite business world and the academic world understand what that means. Equity is a word that benefits from sounding very similar to equality. So virtually everyone wants equality, which has been classically defined by, I believe, Burke as the same starting line for everyone. We don't quite get to that, but in the American middle class, we're pretty damn close. That everyone supports. Everyone supports public school, free lunch vouchers are supported by 85% or more of people. Everyone supports an end to segregation. Equity is something different, and it is generally defined, if you look at the Kendi DeAngelo school, as a quote unquote exactly proportionate number of people from every group that you want represented. So an equitable, I just gave one, the equitable NBA would be 61% Caucasian, it would be 13% Black, it would be 7% Asian, it would be 50% female, and it would be utterly unwatchable. So I don't think this is a useful goal in many fields. Affirmative action within some limits, I don't have much of a problem with. I.e., if you're a boss and you're saying, I want to get to 10% bluntly Blacks in this department, and so we're going to relax the credentials by 5%. Okay, management decisions like that are made all the time. If you say we're going to get to exactly 13% African Americans in every division of this good-sized college, I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to encounter not only some legal problems with that, as whites and Asians are going to stand up and start bringing these suits in a couple of years, you are also going to encounter some extraordinary difficulties. Only about 6% of Black people, if I recall correctly, get PhDs, and half of those are in education. So you're not going to necessarily be able to have an aquaculture division that is 14% African-American women or something like that. So equity very often seems like a doomed goal that is in fact designed to keep these programs in place forever at their current rates.
Okay.
Could it be?
Well, we're running out of time, and I feel like we could have this conversation for much longer. I do want to ask you one last question with our last minute, and that is, what's the next project? You've had some interesting books, and I want to know where you're headed next.
Well, I actually have been offered book deals for my next two book ideas. The one of them that I'm probably going to do is a look at the modern American academy and where academia is going. This won't be especially partisan, actually, but I'm going to look at kind of the rise of the woke movement. I mean, an incredible percentage of the majors now being granted in quote unquote the studies or jokingly the grievance fields. The debt model, is that sustainable? Does it make sense to go for 6 years and get a degree in post-colonial feminist theory, to use the old joke? I mean, but beyond that, what are alternatives in education? I mean, you guys are college professors and are very aware of the things Harvard and MIT are putting online. If you can basically go to Harvard for free for 3 years and then pay essentially to go to Harvard for a year and graduate with anything resembling a Harvard degree, what's going to be the sales model for the smaller regional college? I mean, I think that, I'll close with this. I think that the model would be good education with no bullshit. Eliminating a lot of the DEI stuff that's just nonsense at the extremes. For a lot of these institutions, it really should be D2 or D3, cutting back athletics. Not having a semi-sponsored campus party culture. When I think of those, the Southern Illinois and the schools I went to, just focusing on teaching kids math and English. And I think that there always will be a place for institutions doing that. The collegiate group we have right now, though, will probably have to downsize, and there's going to be an interesting competition around who survives.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you spending the hour with us. I want to thank you. I want to thank the college for letting us use the webinar system and hosting this event. And thank you to everyone who attended and joined us this evening. I appreciate the comments and questions. And thank you again, Dr. Reilly, for your time.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking to you guys.
Hey, what's your favorite pistol to shoot?
Right now, probably third gen Glock 17, actually. The other one that I have is an S&W Shield that we got originally because my girlfriend, my partner, liked it because it was smaller. So we've got a couple. I also have a longbow, so all kind of macho equipment laying around the house.
Well, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks, sir.